Charlotte Brontë entered the world as spring crept across the moors. April 21, 1816. Born in Thornton, West Yorkshire, into a world both harsh and poetic. Her father, an Irish Anglican clergyman, was austere and fiercely intellectual. Her mother, Maria, quiet and gentle, already weary from bearing 6 children. When Charlotte was only a toddler, the family moved to the parsonage at Haworth. Here, high on the hill, overlooking graveyards and bramble, the Brontës made their strange, luminous home. The air was thick with dampness and silence. The moors whispered, and Charlotte listened. The Brontë children lived in 2 worlds, one made of hearth and hardship, the other of pure invention. They read voraciously Shakespeare, Byron, the Arabian Nights. By candlelight, they conjured kingdoms, drafted treaties, staged rebellions. Charlotte and Branwell built Angria, a wild, fictional empire ruled by passion and war. Emily and in dreamt-up Gondal, where melancholy reigned and love was fierce. The moors were their theater. The parlor was a court of kings. Tiny books sewn together by small fingers became the archives of their invented universe. For Charlotte, words became more than play, they became escape, prayer, identity. In 1824, when Charlotte was only 8, her world fractured. She and her older sisters Maria and Elizabeth were sent to Cowan Bridge School, a place of harsh rules, cold food, and colder hearts. Illness spread like smoke among the underfed girls. Within months, Maria and Elizabeth fell gravely ill. By spring, they were gone. Charlotte watched as her sisters faded, as their coffins passed through the church gate. The loss carved something permanent in her. Grief became a chamber within her soul, one she would never truly leave. The world she returned to was smaller, but it made her more defiant, more inward, more determined to preserve the remaining sisters with everything she had. Grief sharpened their imagination. With Maria and Elizabeth gone, the surviving Brontës turned inward and downward into the depths of invention. Angria, Glasstown, Gondal, imaginary kingdoms sprawling across years of paper and play. These were no mere stories. They were living histories with generations of characters, political intrigue, forbidden romance. Charlotte's heroes and heroines bore pain, pride, longing. They were her hidden autobiography. She wrote obsessively, feverishly. Even as a teenager, her prose blazed with strange force. The tiny books they stitched by hand became a secret archive, a library of longing in miniature. These stories were a refuge, yes, but also an apprenticeship. Without realizing it, Charlotte was preparing for the novel that would one day make her immortal. Though different in temperament, Charlotte the fire, Emily the wind, the sisters were each other's mirror. Charlotte expressive and controlled, Emily raw and elemental. Emily rarely spoke, but when she did, her words cut through stone. She moved like part of the landscape. One moment within reach, the next dissolved into mist. They wrote in silence, shared fragments, sharpened ideas. The bond between them was fierce, an unspoken covenant forged in ink and grief. They understood that stories were not diversions, but lifelines. Together, they held a secret. One day, the world would read what they'd written. One day, their imagined voices would echo louder than even death could silence. In 1831, Charlotte stepped through the stone arches of Roe Head School, a timid girl with a storm in her mind. Her body small, her voice quieter still, but her intellect burned. She was not like the others, these polished daughters of privilege. She was raw, bookish, strange, but within weeks she rose, top of the class, eyes wide with hunger for Latin, for history, for structure and reason. But knowledge came at a cost. She could not sleep, her stomach twisted with anxiety. She wasted away on pride and pressure, barely eating, barely speaking. Even her victories brought no comfort, only deeper isolation. And yet, amid the pain, friendships were born. Ellen Nussey, Mary Taylor. Through letter and loyalty, they would become the mirrors she needed, the witnesses to her inner world. At night, Charlotte wrote in secret, tales of far-off lands, of kings and war and rebellion. She was building a second life, one that would eventually eclipse the silence of the classroom. Governess, a title that promised respect and delivered invisibility. Between 1839 and 1841, Charlotte Brontë became a guest in gilded cages, first at Stonegap, then at Rawdon. She taught other people's children how to read, how to behave, how to shine. And in return, she was paid in cold glances and loneliness. She loathed it, the distance between her soul and their silk, the falseness of polite society. Her letters are scorched with contempt. The trouble is not that I am poor, it is that I am small. Every snub became observation, every silence a page unwritten. She stored it all, the tyranny of class, the weight of invisibility. She learned how the rich played pretend, how women wore masks, how children inherited cruelty. And yet, always the fire. At night, she scribbled in journals. She dreamed not of escape, but of retribution. Not vengeance, but narrative. She would not forget what it felt like to be powerless, because one day she would write herself free. By 1842, the Brontë sisters wanted more than obscurity. They wanted Europe, refinement, a way forward. So Charlotte and Emily sailed to Brussels, to the pension at Heger, where French and literature were taught with exacting precision. It was intoxicating. The bells of Brussels, the foreign language unfolding like music, the art, the architecture, the freedom of reinvention. But towering above all was Monsieur Heger, rigid, electric, exacting. Charlotte had never met a mind like his. He tore apart her compositions, forced her to feel, to rewrite, to burn through platitudes. She fell in love, silently, tortuously, completely. When she returned to England, the world felt dimmer. She wrote him letter after letter, yearning, intelligent, desperate. He did not reply. He gave no comfort, but he had done something else. He had ignited her. In his indifference, he gave her fire. The fire she would shape into Rochester, into Paul Emanuel, into her Gothic, smoldering men. 1846. In the hush of their parsonage, the Brontë sisters committed a quiet act of revolution. They were women, but they would publish like men. Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. The names were masks but also shields. Behind them, the sisters sent their poems into the world. The world barely blinked. 2 copies sold. The press paid no attention. But the sisters had crossed a line. They were no longer writing for each other. They were writing to be heard. Charlotte's poems were jagged with passion. They were not dainty, not domestic. They raged against the limits of existence. Life is not as idle or, she wrote, but iron dug from central gloom. This was not the end. It was the ignition. One by one, the sisters began novels. And with Agnes Grey, Emily with Wuthering Heights, and Charlotte, heart still raw from Brussels, sat down to write the story that had been pulsing inside her all along. Jane Eyre was too passionate, too unladylike, too honest. It peeled back the corset strings of Victorian morality and asked, what if a woman claimed equality, not just in love, but in thought? Thackeray praised it as brilliance incarnate. Others called it a preacher's daughter gone rogue. It was impossible to ignore. The mysterious Currer Bell became both myth and scandal. Who dared say, I am no bird, and no net ensnares me? Letters poured in. Publishers begged for more. Invitations arrived for the elusive author. And so Charlotte, small, shy, eyes always darting to the floor, stepped into the glittering rooms of London society. But there was no victory in it, only a quiet strangeness. They wanted the mask Currer Bell, not the woman who wrote behind it. In those salons, she was observed, not embraced. The applause came with questions she couldn't answer. Still, the fire had caught, and it would not go out. While Charlotte's Jane Eyre climbed the heights of acclaim, her sisters too had laid their offerings before the world. Wuthering Heights, Emily's violent, dreamlike storm of a novel, bewildered and frightened readers. Agnes Grey, Anne's sharp, observant tale of governess life, was subtler, but no less pointed. The Brontë sisters, hidden under borrowed names, were changing English literature from the edge of civilization. There was something ancient in Emily's words, as if written by the earth itself. And the youngest saw clearly the hypocrisy of Victorian virtue. Together, they were a constellation. Three fierce voices born under the same roof, carved from the same grief. For a brief, trembling moment, all three Brontë sisters were published. The parsonage had become a forge. Words were their weapons, their refuge, their rebellion. But time would not allow them to write together for long. Once, he had been the family's brightest hope. Branwell charming, artistic, the only son. His childhood ruled their imaginary kingdoms. But life defeated him. Alcohol, opium, humiliation. He failed at painting, failed at love, failed at keeping his dreams alive. By the 1840s, Branwell Brontë was a ghost in his own home. He raged, wept, wrote wild letters. He paced the hallways at night like a lost child. The sisters watched helplessly. Charlotte tried to save him. But you cannot save someone who will not grasp your hand. In September 1848, Branwell died, consumed by addiction and regret. He was only 31. The house fell into silence. But the silence would deepen. The next sorrow was already moving down the lane. 3 months after Branwell's death, Emily followed. She would not see a doctor. She would not be coddled. Consumption was eating her lungs, but she walked the moors until she collapsed. When she died, December 19, 1848, it was as if the wind itself had stilled. Charlotte was gutted, but grief had barely knocked when it returned again. And gentle Anne was already fading. She agreed to travel to Scarborough, hoping sea air might restore her. It did not. She died in May 1849. 2 sisters buried. One in Haworth, one by the sea. Charlotte, once surrounded by kindred minds, now found herself utterly alone. No more whispered ideas in the night. No more shared drafts. The fire was hers to tend, alone. And yet, from these ashes she kept writing. With the publication of Jane Eyre, Charlotte Brontë's world changed forever. The unknown Currer Bell had set the literary world ablaze, and once her true identity was revealed, admiration deepened. Here was a woman, small, plain, unassuming, who had written a novel as fierce as any man's, more penetrating than most. She was invited to London, toasted in salons, praised by the likes of Thackeray. Yet she moved through this world like a visitor in a foreign land. The London glitter, the endless conversations, the flattery, it left her weary. She missed her sisters. Emily, already frail, barely celebrated the triumph, and grew quieter by the day. Branwell spiraled further into despair, and Charlotte, now famous, was still deeply alone. She wrote again, Shirley, a novel of industrial unrest and female independence. Then Villette, her most introspective and haunting work. It was a book of memory, of loss, of yearning, a reflection of herself. As acclaim mounted, so did silence at home. Every success echoed louder in the emptiness of the parsonage. Charlotte had achieved what so few women of her time dared to dream, but she had paid for it in solitude, in grief, in pages soaked with memory. And yet, she kept writing because to write was to live. To write was to remain. She wrote as if possessed. Jane Eyre was more than fiction. It was a declaration. An orphan girl with no beauty, no money, no protection. Yet with a soul that demanded to be seen, to be equal, to be loved on her own terms. It was Charlotte's soul, barely veiled. The manuscript was submitted under the name Currer Bell. The publishers hesitated, then accepted. And when Jane Eyre emerged in 1847, it struck the literary world like a thunderclap. Critics were stunned. Who is Currer Bell? They asked. Was it a man? Was it real? Who dared to write a woman so fierce, so moral, so independent? The novel soared. It became an instant sensation. Charlotte remained cloaked in anonymity for now, but behind closed doors she could feel it. She had spoken, and the world had listened. He was quiet, reserved, almost dull. Arthur Bell Nichols, her father's curate, was a man of earnest piety and few words. He had admired Charlotte for years, from the back pew, through quiet glances and steady gestures. In 1853, he asked for her hand. Charlotte was stunned. Her father was outraged. Nichols was beneath her, both in intellect and ambition. And Charlotte herself wavered. Marriage had always seemed a distant land. She had built her own world, her own name. She declined, but something lingered. As months passed, Nichols resigned and prepared to leave Haworth. And in his absence, Charlotte found herself writing letters not of coldness, but longing. This wasn't romance as in her novels, no Rochester, no Tempest. It was gentler, sadder, more real. And when her father, aging now, relented, Charlotte reconsidered. What she accepted was not a fairy tale, but perhaps, for the first time, the possibility of peace. On June 29, 1854, Charlotte Brontë became Charlotte Nichols. She was 38 years old. For the first time, she wore the word wife. It was not a sweeping passion, but it was gentle, unexpectedly so. Arthur was patient, reverent, tender. He worshipped her quietly, and she, surprised by joy, began to allow herself happiness. In their brief travels through Ireland to Banagher, she saw new landscapes, met new minds. She wrote of her contentment with wonder, almost disbelief. Her health improved. Her nightmares ceased. There was talk of writing again, of a novel waiting to bloom. But happiness, for Charlotte, always stood on a knife's edge, and soon it would slip once more into shadow. The winter of 1854 came early and cruel. Charlotte fell ill, first with nausea, then with fever, then weakness so great she could barely stand. At first, it was believed to be pregnancy. But as the weeks dragged on and her body withered, darker possibilities emerged. No one knew for certain: typhus, tuberculosis, hyperemesis gravidarum. But whatever it was, it came not like a thief, but like a slow eclipse. She stopped writing. Her letters grew faint. Even Arthur, by her side, could not will her well again. In March 1855, after 9 months of marriage, Charlotte Brontë closed her eyes for the final time. She was just 38. Charlotte was the last to go. Branwell, Emily, and all had vanished into the soil of Haworth. Now she too was gone. The parsonage became a tomb of words. Patrick Brontë outlived every one of his children. Arthur remained a curate, withdrawn and heartbroken. The rooms grew silent, save for wind rattling the panes and rain tapping on slate. But her stories did not die. Even in death, Charlotte Brontë stirred readers across continents. Jane Eyre sold, then soared. Translations bloomed. Her life, so small, so contained, had birthed novels of defiant flame. She had not merely written books. She had torn down doors for every woman writer who followed. Her words echo across centuries, across oceans. Jane Eyre became not only a novel but a rallying cry. Shirley, Villette, the professor, each one a new kind of heroine, a woman with thought, fire, and soul. She wrote not as an ornament, but as a force. Hers was not a life of grand travel or worldly fame. She walked the same moors every day, sat at the same desk, held the same pen. And yet, through that narrow life, she opened a doorway for millions. In the heathered hush of Yorkshire, the wind still carries her name. Charlotte, wild, defiant, enduring.